Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jennifer Dunn, Senior Vice President of People and Culture for AMC Networks and C2HR board member. I'm so glad you're here with us this afternoon to welcome back Maria Arias as she leads a discussion that is truly hitting home for a lot of us. And that is parenting in the pandemic, which I can relate to, having 3 sons and working remotely. Before I introduce today's presenters, I want to remind you that this session is being recorded and will be available for on-demand viewing. Also, time permitting, there will be Q&A at the end of the session, so please post your questions by using the Ask button, which you'll find at the lower left-hand side of your screen. We're so thrilled to have 3 outstanding professionals with us today. We have Angela Aus, who's Vice President, Human Resources with Univision Communications. Dave Crossen is Senior Vice President, Human Resources with NBC Universal Broadcast and Distribution. And Seth Feit, Group Vice President, Talent for Charter Communications. So with that, I'll turn it over to Maria, if you could please get us started.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, and it's a pleasure to be with everyone here this afternoon. Thanks for joining to an issue that's near and dear to so many of us. It seems like years ago when life was bustling and hustling and we were all headed to work and our kids were going to school and we were traveling, and then March of 2020 happened and the world changed. The shutdowns from west to east, kids being sent home, the summer months, the return to school now, and then trying to figure out what's next, particularly at a time when the conditions across the country, states to state, and sometimes even within states, and the government requests for action change, sometimes on a weekly or monthly basis. So today we're going to talk with Angela, Dave, and Seth about a little bit about their life and their experience and how they're handling it, but more importantly, because they are HR leaders of major companies and organizations, we want to talk today about how it's impacting their workforce and what the issues that they're facing, what they're working on, and kind of what's next. So with that, why don't we go ahead and start with you, Dave? Why don't you tell us a little bit about your family situation and how the pandemic has impacted it and how you're leading from home?
Thanks, Maria, and hi, everybody. I'm a father of 2 elementary school kids, sons, one's 7, one's 8, live in New Jersey. And my wife is also a working mom. We're both at home working for the most part, a little bit of commuting, but mostly at home. And my boys for this semester are back in a hybrid school situation. So they're in 2 or 3 days a week. We're fortunate enough to have some help with a nanny who is around when they're home to kind of help cajole them into the homeschooling piece. But that's a little bit of background for me. Just professionally, I work at NBC Universal. I'm the HR leader for the owned stations group and distribution group as well. And I'm a C2HR board member too.
Excellent. Angela, tell us about your family situation. I think it's a little bit different based on the discussion we had a few days ago.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. So I am the mother of 2 as well. I have a daughter who's in high school. She's a sophomore, and I have a son who's 7, who also is ASD, so that's autism spectrum disorder. So for us, the pandemic's been really difficult because of the socialization aspect and having him home. My husband has a totally different line of work, so he's got a little bit more flexibility. So in the beginning, he actually was furloughed and helped a lot when we were a little bit crazy, so that helped me. And then I also have my mother, who's 81 years old, who lives with us. And while you may all think, wow, that's great, lots of extra hands, sometimes it's a little bit more like my 4th child, my 3rd being my husband. So for me, we're in a hybrid model as well. And, you know, it's been a huge adjustment. I am lucky enough that I have a person who's part-time, who's known my kids since my daughter was 3, who comes over and helps. And I can tell you that there are days when she can get my son, who's really the one that needs the most help, focused on school, and other times when I've got to find 5 minutes or 2 minutes to go downstairs and try, cajole him into getting it done. But it's working for what it's worth. I think we've all adjusted a little bit to what we're going through. And and every day it's just a new day. Every day we do something different. And as you guys know, when we were doing when we had our first just a group discussion on this, my son barged in the room. And that's not usually typical, but it does happen. And I've seen lots of people respond well to that.
Great. Seth, I hear you have 3 teenagers.
I do. That's right. Hi, everybody. I feel like I'm getting a little too much airtime here at C2HR. I think this is my 4th time on today, so maybe people are getting a little sick of me, but I'm happy to be back. And one of my favorite subjects are my kids. I'm a proud father of 3, like you mentioned, Maria. She's just turned 19 today. She's a freshman in college at the time the pandemic hit. She was a senior in high school, so I feel really awful for her missing out on spring sports and prom and a real graduation, and then uncertainty going to college. So that's a whole different parenting challenge. And then my 2 teenage boys are 11th grade and 7th grade right now. I mean, I hear, Dave and Angela's stories. I'm grateful I don't have that elementary age kid, because I think that's a whole different stratosphere of home challenges. Not that my middle schooler and high schooler are fully capable of self-learning themselves, but they're at least a little more independent. So we're fortunate with that. My wife works from home. I happen to be pretty regularly in the office. I'm here in my office right now. And given that we're a cable company and considered an essential provider, especially during this pandemic, we've generally kept our offices open. Now, it's with a lot of caveats, with social distancing, providing PPE, making the environment, as good as we can make it for our employees. And we have a lot of people on some rotating kind of shifts, like AB schedules. But for the most part, I've been generally coming into the office every day. And I think that was kind of essential those first few months of the pandemic, because with 3 kids doing school from home and my wife all working from home and the barking dog, it was nice to have a little bit more semblance of coming into an office. So I consider myself fortunate to have continued that pace when the pandemic first hit. And now, as a company, I'm the head of talent for Charter, so I've got a pretty big team. So I obviously am dealing with some of my own employees and kind of the care and feeding of my own employees of being an HR leader. I know my team looks to me quite a bit for some direction on how they can manage their personal lives, and we all have a variety of challenges. But we've done a good job, I think, as a company of, trying to make as many, medical or school-related accommodations depending on the situation. If you have jobs that can be done remotely, a lot of our jobs are customer-facing, or a retail store, or a technician, and those are, you can't do it for those jobs. You've got to be in the stores. You've got to be in the customer's home. So as a company, we definitely have to look at that broader lens.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things I want to talk about a little bit later, in terms of the difference between having workforces that are professionals and can work remotely, and the impact of the pandemic on them and their childcare and other needs, as opposed to essential workers that have to continue day to day. And the same thing, they have different childcare challenges. So Angela, let's go back to you. Let's talk a little bit about leadership. And as an HR leader, Seth mentioned a little bit, some of the work that he's been doing with the workforce at Charter, but how has the pandemic changed the way your team has to manage through the day-to-day issues that come up with an HR department?
So I'll speak a little bit to my personal team, and I'll try to, provide some color about my colleagues, because for me, and I don't have really any essential personnel that are part of my client group. So for me and my team, it's been maybe a little bit easier. I mean, nothing's been easy this year, but I would say we've got, a professional workforce that can, for the most part, work remotely very effectively. But there are parts of our organization that are essential personnel. Our news and local stations have people that are going in every day. And I think that does pose a very different dynamic. And I'm sure, Dave, you can sort of probably speak to it in much more detail, as well as Seth. The challenges that we're experiencing are really around helping leaders stay connected to their employees, hearing from employees sort of a high burnout rate, if you will. Everyone's talking about feeling much longer days. The days blend into each other. Some of the requests that we've gotten early have been, what can we do to alleviate some of that? And so we've put together a couple of presentations to help employees think about how, not only what to do for themselves, so something as simple as, listen, you used to have a commute, you don't have that anymore. Why don't you dedicate that time to something that maybe you wanted to do all the time that you haven't had time to do? Maybe you've complained about not having time to exercise. Well, maybe use that time to do that, as opposed to just using it for more work, which is what creates that really long day and that blending of like, work, family, and life is just all in one place. But also what they can do for their colleagues. And that's where time management and just being respectful of other people's situations. This is a panel about parenting, and I think we've got obviously lots of folks who have children, or I would venture to say maybe it's not children, maybe it's also some other responsibility like an elderly parent that they've got to be there for, and all of a sudden it's much more difficult. So we've had many leaders be very flexible about working hours, respect time. I have somebody on my team who I adore who has a relatively young son. And, I try to be really good about not bothering her when she's got to go get her son, because I know that that's the time when she's got to go get him. And, while we love seeing him on the screen, we also know that it's stressful for her, right? Because you've got to manage the child. So for us, it's been really more about how to help leaders connect, how to help leaders and employees be respectful of themselves and their colleagues, to continue to be effective, to continue to stay connected. And I think it's been different for some of my colleagues that have the essential personnel.
Great, thanks, Angela. Dave, what about you? Let's talk a little bit about, Angela mentioned some of the advice and suggestions for leaders on how to manage their work life as well as their employees. Is there anything that NBC Universal is doing for its employees? There was an article Monday, actually, in the Wall Street Journal saying exactly some of the things that Angela just said, encouraging employees to take time off for self-care, asking managers to check in with their employees, and the, hey, how are you doing isn't enough anymore, because we recognize this is a different world. What are some of the things perhaps that you are doing with your teams to make sure that issues of mental health and burnout from the extensive hours, the round-the-clock nature of work today?
Yeah, and good question. And I do want to agree with something Angela said about the importance of respecting people's time. And she makes a great point about the day has just blended into one amorphous amount of time. And I think for me, some of the leadership piece comes down to modeling the behavior. And so to the extent I talk to leaders, managers, and most of my client group is in the owned stations environment, which is sort of by definition a 24/7, if you will. And we have had, 40% of our employees in that group have been essential workers or core employees who've been either out in the field or in the facility. One of the challenges that leaders has is many of them have this sort of bifurcated group team where they've got some people who are in a fairly regular work day, and then there are people at home, and they have to flex both ways. I think at NBCU, and particularly in the group that I work in, we did a lot initially by way of education and communication to all of our employees about, we had webinars describing, what we then knew about COVID and what we didn't know with medical experts. So that was really important to sort of be transparent and educate people. We've preached flexibility as much as we can. That is challenging when you have that bifurcated workforce. But, I think one of the things that we've been very encouraging of leaders is to, explore very different ways of communicating. So we've all done Zoom team type of communication, but encouraging people to, pick up the phone and use as many different mediums as possible. In terms of what NBC Universal is doing by way of sort of additional benefits, if you like, particularly for parents and caregivers, I think we have a fairly strong story on that. We have always had a pretty robust backup childcare benefit, which we administer through Bright Horizons. And we made a number of enhancements to that this year, expanding the number of days that people are eligible to use the backup childcare. But perhaps even more significantly, we have expanded that provision to allow for people to use it to employ their own personal out of network, if you like, childcare resources. So if you engage with a neighbor to look after your kids, then you can get reimbursed for that. Will be the sort of example, which has been very well received, as you can imagine. It's not something that I think we're going to be able to do long term, but in this crisis moment, that was something that was very well received, and I think has helped leaders in turn who manage those people to have a little bit better clarity about what they expect from their teams.
Great, thank you, Dave. Seth, you have a workforce that perhaps includes essential workers like the techs, call center reps, dispatchers. Back in the day when I ran cable systems, we used to have safety meetings, in person once a week. We used to have huddles for our care center reps when, we wanted to bring out new training or just kind of bring the teams together. Everybody's in Zoom burnout, so great suggestion, Dave. Pick up the phone, just talk to somebody. What are some of the things that you're doing, for example, for some of your frontline workers, and how are your tech suits leading and your dispatch managers leading in these times?
I'm happy to talk pretty briefly about that. I don't want to steal too much thunder from a Tuesday session that Paul Marchand is delivering. He's our CHRO, was on that panel earlier today. He's going to run a little session around HR leading through a pandemic, and they'll get into a lot of the nuts and bolts of that. But the high level, we early on put out some COVID flex time for employees to be able to kind of flex their schedules as they saw fit. We have a relatively distributed HR model at our company. We're 95,000 employees, and Paul's our head of HR, but there are HR organizations within our different business units that align to the executive vice presidents of their groups. And Paul did a masterful job of pulling those teams together. I think we were meeting twice a week for a while there. We've moved to weekly meetings that we still keep now, where he touches base with the HR leaders, make sure we really understand what the needs are out there, and have created as best we can programs that support that front line, and also knowing how essential those jobs really are, right? And we're more in solidarity with our frontline employees. I don't pretend that my job is really keeping the internet up and running, but I like to think that the hiring that we're doing and the training that we're doing and the tools and systems that we have set up are what's helping to keep the company going forward. And that's really a way that we've aligned our HR resources and our approach to the culture at the company.
Great. So let's talk a little bit about recruiting. Angela, has the pandemic changed the way you and your team recruit?
So I'll start by saying we, obviously at the beginning of the pandemic, we took a little bit of a pause on hiring because we weren't sure what to expect, how long this was going to last, what was the impact going to be, to the company financially, and so on. And what we did during that period of time is we started focusing on how do we help market ourselves better as an employer. How do we, update our external websites? So our head of talent has really done a nice job working with people doing that. As it relates to actual recruiting, I'll tell you, there's a job that I'm recruiting for now. I need a digital CFO for that matter. So if anyone knows of anyone, please let me know. And it's been different, but it's been fine, right? I mean, I think we have all gotten very accustomed to using Zoom. And while Dave, I take your point that there is like burnout on that too, right? I think it's worked fine. We've identified other websites now to actually post on. And it really hasn't impacted us significantly from the attract and even like the interview process. I can tell you that even from an onboarding standpoint, I have a member of my team whose first day was March 16th, which was the first week that we were all home, and had to onboard her completely remotely, had to find ways to get her acclimated and meeting clients in a very virtual environment. And it worked out okay. And I think if you asked her, she'd say it's been fine. I think it just requires an adjustment, right? You actually have to put a lot more thought into it up front. How am I going to do this? What am I going to do? How am I going to ensure that we get a feel for the person, right? Because when you're interviewing in person, you get a feel for the individual. And I think that that's important to really, get a sense of, is this person also going to acclimate well to the environment? And while Zoom and Teams or any of the virtual tools can give you a feel for that, I don't know that it really does it entirely. So we have to find different ways. And I find myself having longer conversations with candidates around just them, how they're doing. This is a point in time when we have to be kind, not only to ourselves, but to other people. And so we spend more time just getting to know, how have you been dealing with the pandemic? And I actually think that that's a good way to get a feel for the person. Like, what have they been going through? How have they dealt with it? How do they crisis manage, if you will, for themselves? So those are some of the things that I would say have impacted us from a recruiting standpoint. But for the most part, I think it's just required more upfront planning, but it's working out okay and leveraging technology.
That's great. Dave, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to repeat a lot of what Angela said, which goes for me too. So I think, I agree with all of that, frankly. The other thing I'd add is there's the other angle, which is, and I don't think we're there yet, but the notion that our talent pools are in theory dramatically expanded if you buy into the fact that we have, we maybe can work remotely in the long term. We're still, as a company, deliberating exactly the extent to which we're going to embrace remote working, post COVID, whatever that means. But so that's the other thing I'd say. I mean, if you think about our recruitment strategy, we're now potentially open to hiring people who are located outside of market for certain jobs, obviously. And so that's something that is, I think, exciting. It was mentioned on the one of the earlier breakout groups. That's could be an asset to a diversity recruiting strategy, of course, because it opens up other avenues. So that's the one thing I'd add to what Angela said. I agree with all the things, and I like the point about when you're actually in the candidate evaluation process, finding out a little bit about how they are personally managing the crisis could be revealing.
Agree completely.
Another job if I had to be totally candid about my.
No, I just want to highlight the point that you made, that I think that, back in the day when I was working on aspirational goals and we looked at kind of in-market talent, but the reality is all of your companies and many of the C2 HR participating companies are national and many international organizations. And so I think the pandemic, when I look back, 2 or 3 years from now, hopefully sooner, about some of the lessons I learned was kind of the proof that given the right technology and culture and circumstances, you can have remote working relationships. There's nothing like the in-person. I mean, we all miss it. We all crave that, but it does open up the talent pool for people of color and women, veterans, people with disabilities, the whole spectrum. It opens up the market dramatically, so that's great. Seth, what about recruiting at Charter? Anything that you want to add to what the panel has said?
Well, building on a couple of things, and I have I guess a bit of a contrary take as well. Similarly, we're fortunate we had invested in a bunch of the online virtual kind of tools, and we're able to turn relatively quickly with that, with our various business units doing, virtual job fairs and a lot of, utilizing our assessment tools. And we were also fortunate that in some of those hairier months as a country and a world, April, May, we were still full-blown hiring. We were keeping our hiring at the same levels, and we were able to keep the train running and be able to, keep the recruiting engine moving. And I don't want to say it was that much easier per se, because the increased candidate pool kind of complicates it a little bit. And then, you still have your niche areas you're recruiting for, but, we were fortunate that we had invested in a bunch of those, online kind of tools. And then, even in the pandemic, I mean, we're still very much reporting into the office. There's a variety of, flexible schedules out there, but we as a company are still a very much come to the office kind of environment. So, we have lost some candidates, unfortunately, when you're talking to them and they're seeking more of that, kind of ongoing, more permanent kind of flexibility. but it's better to be upfront with the candidates, so they know what they're getting themselves into. And we value that come into the office kind of environment, and especially in solidarity with our, frontline kind of roles. That's sort of the environment that we have as a company. So it's, we've lost some people, but we were losing them if they were looking for that flexibility, a year ago as well. It's just, it's maybe more of a spotlight on it since we have more flexibility now than we've historically had. But, hopeful that as the world gets a little bit more back to normal, we'll be, piling into our offices a little bit more and having, more of that community and camaraderie, in person together. It looks like Dave wants to jump in.
Yes.
Yeah, if I may, Maria, just because I've got a thought about what Seth said, and I can relate, because I think much of my business feels the same way. But one of the things that you hear now and again is, as Microsoft and some other, stereotypically progressive companies, are out there with messages like, "Hey, we don't care where you live, you can come." I mean, I think that is that on the face of it is a competitive advantage for some of those companies in attracting people who, want to sit on a beach and work. But I think it's going to be fascinating to see how that actually plays out, because I remember seeing a headline, the article was, but it was a bunch of CEOs, including CEOs of tech firms, all expressing their personal opinion that they look forward to getting back to when we have a lot more in-person work. So I think there may be an interesting phenomenon that happens when, post-vaccine, let's say, when people are going back in whatever form they are, and some of these companies that are out there saying, "We don't care where you are," may regret that posture a little bit, because, their culture may not accept that totally remote model.
Yeah, I was just going to comment, Dave, that, for us, you made the point that like the candidate pools opened up because of remote work. And for us, we definitely have people who are moving to places where we don't really have business, right? But it's, but we're being very clear that the workplace is, New York City, let's say, right? Like, understand you moved here, but the workplace is here. And at such time when we come back, we expect you to be here. We're trying to be flexible. We're not telling you where to live, right? But at the same time, we haven't quite made up our mind. We are definitely looking at what jobs obviously have to be done on site, what jobs could be more hybrid, because I do think there are functions or jobs where you lose a lot, right? It's always a trade-off, but where you lose a lot of the spontaneous learning or the spontaneous interaction when you're not at least sometimes together. And then, but we're also looking at, okay, well, what jobs probably could be 100% remote? And I think at that point, it's when we can say, okay, well, this really opens up where we recruit from, where we hire, what's our employee value proposition as it results to that. And then I do think that's where it could be a lot more helpful to parents or employees who have some other care responsibility. And I keep saying that because I think it's, certainly this is difficult for parents because they've got the education component to it. But I've also seen folks who have other responsibilities where it's taken a toll because maybe the elderly parent can't go to the same social things that they were doing to keep them engaged, and now they're noticing other issues and other symptoms that their parents are having that they're having to deal with.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think everyone has raised some great points, and in thinking about the future and what roles ideally can be remote without any significant impact, it's also about, what roles require a lot of stakeholder relationship building. I think about when I was working on diversity initiatives and, setting up appointments with the executives, but if you ran into them in the elevator, in the hallway, you could have that 10-minute chat and get so much work done, which is, I think, what a lot of people miss. Is the in-person workplace allowed you to do a lot of things spontaneously and to make connections that now have to be, as you said, Angela, more planned and require a little bit more thought. So, hopefully we can resume some of that. We've talked a little bit about talent recruitment, and we can touch upon development, but there's been a lot about women in the workforce and the progress that has been made with over 50% of women working in the workforce, and some statistics about how women control 60% of the personal wealth. 40% of women now out-earn men. and 50% of women are buying traditionally male products. I want to know how they define that, but I couldn't, there were no footnotes. But things like cars and electronics, right? Someone has now described the pandemic and what our economy is going to is not a recession, but a she-cession, because of the impact that the pandemic is having on working women. And we're seeing so many women drop out of the workforce. For example, just here in Colorado, the Colorado Women's Chamber was on Colorado Public Radio this weekend talking about the impact and the losses, the job losses here of 5% already, just as a result of the pandemic, and the impact in real dollars that that has on organizations in terms of, how expensive it is to lose employees and have to hire and train up. So I wanted to bring up the issue of, are you seeing in your organizations women either scaling back or pulling back on their work, or leaving the workforce or taking leaves? And I recognize that there's working women, but there's also working men. And I think it could impact, because I've seen this happen where it's not just, it's men deciding to take the step back sometimes too. So Seth, I see you nodding your head. Do you want to start first?
Well, I mean, I'm nodding it because I understand it can be a challenge, and I'm not intimately familiar with 95,000 employees. I'm sure there are a few cases of this going on. I'm just more kind of smiling in that sense that, in my team in particular, I've got a team of all women that I manage. They're all very successful in their careers, and in many cases are probably more of the breadwinner. And in one situation, their husband actually is home now, and it's kind of, so I have a variety of individual situations on my own team, and we prepped a little bit around culture and those kind of things. And for the whole company, it's really a hard thing to answer, but for like our own groups that we lead, I think we try to create environments that have that flexibility and are supportive. And people with younger age children, it's certainly harder for them to manage than it would be with someone with grown children or doesn't have children at all. But you have to be respectful of their same challenges, what they have, whether it's pets or elderly parents. And, I think a lot of it is more, situational. And at least I like to think that as a leader at my company, I'm empowered to help my own team out. And, we as an overall company, I think we want to make sure that we're providing an environment for people to succeed. So I'm kind of skirting the question a little bit, but I think that it's a real issue for us to monitor, and we've got to be cognizant of it. But we haven't seen a drastic, people having to leave in any kind of droves because of the pandemic and needing to be, more home with the children or something like that. That's
great. Angela, do you want to share your experience?
Sure. We haven't seen like a large pool of people needing to do that, but I do have an example. I have a couple, but one that I'll comment on because it happens to be the man who decided to literally resign from their job so that they could stay home with their child. And they have a child that has a special need. They're having childcare issues. And so I think to your point, Maria, the fact that now women are, maybe in some cases outpacing men in pay, not that I'm saying that that's like across the board, but it certainly happens in situations that, that particular couple decided, okay, woman's going to stay working and the wife's going to stay working and the husband is the one that's going to take a step back. And I know that the team was disappointed. They wish that they could have done more. They were trying to be somewhat accommodating. This is a person who's, has more of a hybrid role. Like sometimes they have to be in the office to help with a show, sort of an S&P operator, and sometimes they don't. They can do it remotely, but it got to the point where it was just the time and the ability to be with the child. And they did. They decided to resign. I think we may see more of that. I can say you talked, Seth, about some of your members of your team who's a husband who stays home. My husband would love to stay home. I would let him do that. It's never happening, but he would love to do that.
Exactly. I said to my husband, you are not retiring till I retire. Dave, what about at NBC Universal? I know you mentioned childcare, which is a great ad.
Yeah, we've done a lot. We're proud of what we've done. Same answer though. We've not actually, really. I'm not aware of any trend in terms of voluntary attrition. I'd say, from people who have caregiving or parenting challenges, and I'd like to think maybe that's because we've enabled some flexibility and provided benefits that have helped people. But I think it's also, frankly, some of this is a function of the macroeconomic environment. People not necessarily being in a position right now to take that big decision to step out of the workforce or the traditional workforce. But we are very aware of the impact that the pandemic and the environment has created that places on working parents, particularly mothers, frankly, and we're sort of mindful of that. One of the things we're starting to think about when we think about return to workplace, if you have a hybrid model, and people, I think, sometimes jump to, well, we can just make it optional. If you can come in, you can come in. If you can work remotely, you can't. That's okay too. But there's a hidden risk in that. And as one of my colleagues coined the term in-person advantage, which is if you do have that voluntary hybrid model, and I'm going to stereotype for a second, and the team of 6 and the 3 young free single 20-somethings come into the office because they can and they want to, and the 3 people who are parents and have other commitments and maybe live a little further away don't, then over time you can imagine how the people who are in the office talking to water cooler and having a lot of FaceTime with management could end up getting an advantage in their career over the people who aren't able to do that. So that's one of the things that we have front of mind as we think about return to work models across our business.
That raises that's a great segue to my next question, which is career development and pathing and exposure, promotions during a time where everything is online, and perhaps some of your organization or those participating in the conference had pre-pandemic some development programs for their high potential employees. Is there a difference in how career pathing is happening nowadays because of the pandemic in your organizations? Seth, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I mean, we're still kind of early in some of our evolution around talent planning and those kind of things, but we did pause talent planning because our normal cycle would have been to do it, in that March, April timeframe. We just sort of backed it up about 3-4 months and had a very successful kind of wrapping it up right now with roll-ups to our CEO, and we're feeling like we're kind of at a good cadence now with that, and we have a lot of other programs. Like we have a VP program that we do normally 2 cohorts in person, with some kind of rotation between our Stamford, Connecticut headquarters and a visit out to Denver. We shifted that to pretty much all virtual. We're hopeful that later in the next year we can bring that cohort together, but we shifted from basically 5 days in an office for 2 different airplane trips for a lot of people to now doing virtual sessions every Wednesday for either 2 or 4 hours over the course of 10 weeks, and then we'll hope to gather that cohort in person next year. And that's been a great program that it's not necessarily earmarked for high potentials per se, but it's a VP program that targets that level and gets some great exposure to the business. And we have a couple hiccups along the way. We're in a good place now with delivering that virtually, and it's just one example of some of the things that we've shifted from a development standpoint.
That's great. How about Univision, Angela?
So we're the smaller of the 3 companies represented here today, I'll just add. And so we do have some, sort of key development programs that are, that require you to be in person to some degree, right? So we have a partnership with Smith College for our women. Great course that we do. It's a week long. Obviously haven't been able to do that this year. We have another one that requires a 2.5-day session, again, sort of immersive and together. We've had to rethink how do we execute that. But we've had the opportunity to leverage some of the actually take advantage of the technology, take advantage of the fact that you maybe for my sales team, they're not traveling as much. So we partnered this year as a pilot with a company called Exec Online and put 5 of our sales leaders through a program, and which was great. They loved it. Exec Online partners with top universities to deliver a variety of different leadership and some subject matter specific training. And the leaders actually said this was a great course. It was great because it was sort of snackable type of learning, virtual with some, video and all of that. And their comment was, doing that this year while I am more remote and maybe have a little bit more flexibility because I'm not traveling and on a plane all the time, it really, really worked. And so I think we're looking for ways to take advantage of that, and be able to still find ways to develop our people and deliver that kind of training.
Great. Dave, what about you at NBC Universal?
Yeah, much the same. We have, we have the Talent Lab, which is our sort of corporate learning and development organization, and they pivoted very quickly to, making many of their programs virtual, and they've been successful. We did pause our talent review, Seth, like you did, and we haven't got it done yet, so we're probably in a longer pause, unfortunately. I think it's just a function of everything else on our plate. The only other thing I'd mention, because much of my answers are similar to Angela and Seth, but just to bring this a little bit more closer to home, I'm very thrilled that we have 65 NBCU people attending the C2HR conference. And unlike prior years where, frankly, we skewed very East Coast for obvious reasons, because it was an easy trip to Philadelphia for people from New York and the East Coast, we've got many more people in our LA businesses, particularly our film business, a heavy participation this year. And for those of you out there, hi. But that's a good example, to Angela's point, of actually turning this into an opportunity to, have people participate in things that maybe traditionally they wouldn't have been able to do.
Agree. And I just want to remind the audience, since we only have a little under 5 minutes left, to please send any questions to the Ask button, and we can take them. But I want to use Dave's comment to segue into kind of lessons learned and what types of issues. Each of you have alluded a little bit to some of the benefits thus far and the discoveries that you're having. But as you think about life post-pandemic at some point, hopefully in 2021, what are the types of issues that you're thinking about? I know we've heard a little bit about dealing with, the balance, a hybrid model. But if we can talk a little bit more about that, but what are some of the other things that are coming to the forefront as a result of your post-pandemic planning, if you're at that point? Angela, do you want to take that first?
Sure. So I commented earlier, we do have reworking teams that are looking at what the future of work, really from a facilities and office perspective, like in which jobs can do that. So that's a body of work that's underway. I think if you're asking, specifically where I think there's other things, to me, it's about how do we redefine leadership. I think if we go back to doing things exactly the way we were doing them before, we've learned nothing. I do think it's an opportunity for us to reflect and identify what has been some good discoveries as a result of this pandemic. Like, what's the learning, and look for that that silver lining, if you will. And for me, it's leadership is probably going to be redefined. I think we will see a lot more hybrid workforces out there. Not to say that you didn't have leaders maybe working in New York City with employees in some other part of the world. That's happened all the time. But I do think it requires a different mindset and a shift to avoid the things that, Dave, you were talking about, right? Like, how do I continuously assess people equally, even if I see some more than I see others, right? What do I value in leaders going forward? And obviously we've always, talked about certain traits, but I think some of the traits are going to be redefined.
And I agree. I think that's a great point, Angela, particularly since I think that the pandemic has done more to push so many of us, not in the Gen Z or millennial generation, into full use of technology and learning by trial and error. Before it's like, here, I have 5 kids. I could pick any one of them and they'd do it for me. Now it's like, learn it yourself because mine are all grown. Yeah. So Seth, what about you?
I hated video before this.
Pardon?
And now I'm like, I said I hated video before this, and now I'm all about it.
Exactly. Seth, how about you? What are you thinking about?
I'll just jump in with a real quick one. I know we're getting a little short on time, but things like we have a group that does some college recruiting, some university stuff, the military bases that we go visit, diversity events that we attend, and all those became virtual. And although I don't think we're going to go 100% virtual going forward, you can get a much broader net when you're doing it without as much travel. And so we're optimistic that we'll find the right blend, but I think we've learned that, our online tools really work and that it could be a great way for sourcing and screening candidates. I think that'll be a interesting post-pandemic kind of, shift for us.
Great. Dave, any last few words?
Yeah, I mean, just to try and bring this back to parenting, obviously we've spent a lot of time talking about broader topics, but I think the context of this is, the parenting piece is important. And look, I think one of the things we've learned is the value of time. Angela kicked off with that, talking about how the day has spread out. But I think for those people who figure out how to manage time well in this environment and beyond, there's a lot of positives that can come of it. I know way more about my kids' school curriculum than I did this time last year, for better or for worse. As somebody I heard mention the other day that, one of the positives or silver linings of the pandemic has been the return of the family dinner. So there are a number of things that I think enable us to think about the way we use our time more productively. So I think, I hope that stays with us at whatever the next phase of this is. And, we and our kids and the people we know have been forced to find new sources of resilience, and that's a word that gets used a lot at the moment, I think appropriately. And so I think that's something that if we can bottle the learning that's come out of this year in terms of better and smarter use of time, and knowing that we're resilient. And one other thing I wanted to put a plug for here is the lifting of the stigma around mental health that I think we're all aware of this year. I think that's another thing that could end up in an ironic way be a positive from what everyone has been through. So there are a number of things that I think, if done right, we can turn into positives coming out of this.
I agree. Well, Seth, Angela, and Dave, thank you so much for joining us in our panel today. We're out of time. I think this is a topic we're going to continue discussions on in the future. And thank you to C2HR for having this panel and starting the conversation. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
The tape is now completely rewound, ready for play. All in thrilling new sound.